And since 1910, there was a report called the Flexner Report. And anyone can look this up. It's a very thick document. And it was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, which changed medicine. It's led us away from what we now call alternative. Back in the day, it was not alternative. It was just natural healing. Things like homeopathy, osteopathic approaches. These things still exist, but they're much less mainstream. And then now the medical schools have the more allopathic approach, which is the pharmaceuticals and so forth. And the allopathic system is influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, which influences not only the media, but the politicians and the med schools. So we end up with a system that's supposed to treat our health, but it's actually incentivized to keep us sick and keep us on medications.
Yes, because it's a money-making system.
It's from a business standpoint, it makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're selling products that are dependent on people being sick, you want them to be sick.
Dag lieve Univibers, wat goed dat je kijkt. We gaan zo kijken naar een uitzending met Mark Gober. Ik ben natuurlijk Baptist de Pape. Maar ik heb heel bijzonder nieuws. Ik heb op 23 november een dagworkshop met een gast die helemaal uit Amerika komt. Hij is een fenomeen in Amerika. Hij heeft honderdduizenden followers op YouTube. En hij heet Kurt Johnson en hij staat bekend op het internet als New World All-Star. En hij is Twin Flame coach. En dan zal je je afvragen, wat is een Twin Flame? Het Twin Flame concept is eigenlijk heel erg simpel. Dat betekent 2 lichamen, 1 ziel. En het blijkt dat duizenden mensen al een Twin Flame ontmoet hebben. En dat zorgt voor een enorme spirituele transformatie. Een ontwakening. Het zorgt voor de Dark Night of the Soul. Het zorgt voor de dood van het ego. Het is een heel ingrijpend event als je Twin Flame ontmoet. Ik ben heel nieuwsgierig naar het hele concept van Twin Flame. Maar ik weet dat het bijna een maatschappelijk probleem is. Dus als jij dit herkent, of als jij denkt van ik heb dit meegemaakt, of als jij denkt van ik wil hier meer van weten, of als je denkt ik wil dit onderzoeken, dan kan je deelnemen aan deze dagworkshop op 23 november 2024. Hij zal plaatsvinden in het midden van het land, in Nieuwegein. En via onderstaande link kan je tickets kopen. Ik hoop je daar te zien. Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van VIBESTALK. Mijn naam is Baptist de Pape en ik heb vanavond wel een heel erg bijzondere gast. Hij is helemaal overgevlogen uit de Verenigde Staten om vanavond hier bij ons te zijn. Zijn naam is Mark Gober en hij is een voormalig investmentbanker. En hij doet al jaren onderzoek naar hoe de wereld werkelijk in elkaar zit. Hij heeft 7 boeken geschreven en zijn laatste boeken zijn ook vertaald naar de Nederlandse taal. En dit is zijn laatste boek, Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. Het is een grote eer dat hij hier te gast is. En wij gaan vanavond met hem praten over hoe de wereld werkelijk in elkaar zit. Mark, welcome to VIBESTALK. It's so good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Great to have you on. You came all the way from the United States. So what is your first impression from the Netherlands?
I'm encouraged by how many people I've met here who are asking questions about what's happening in the world. And that many of the same questions I see in the US, there's a global phenomenon happening.
So there seems to be a shift. But first of all, let's talk about your own journey. So you graduated magna cum laude from Princeton, and then you went on to become an investment banker, and you had this very interesting journey, and now you're a researcher, an author, and you're really diving into how the world is really organized, how the world really works. Can you speak a little bit about your journey? So you went to Princeton, then you graduated, then you went into investment banking. What journey did you make in order to end up where you are now?
Well, let me tell you, I never expected I would be sitting here in the Netherlands talking about books.
Yes.
I would have thought maybe for business meetings, but this was not part of my plan. So like you said, I went to Princeton University for my undergraduate degree. And after that, like many of my classmates, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, but I thought going into finance would be a good thing for my career.
Yes.
Just it would be a safe move, and then I could do things afterwards. So I worked at UBS, which is a large global investment bank based in New York, or the office I worked in was in New York, but it's a Swiss bank. And I was working in 2008. That's when I started. So this was during the financial crisis.
The worst year to start, actually.
The worst time in many ways.
Yeah,
I mean, for my career, I learned a lot, but it was high pressure. I mean, investment banking is high pressure to begin with. But I started in the summer of 2008, and I was there until early 2010. And I was actually in the group at UBS. It's called the Financial Institutions Group, meaning that my clients were banks and insurance companies, asset managers. So my clients were all in distress, and I was at a bank that was in distress.
And was one of your clients Lehman Brothers? Or?
Well, they were in our ecosystem.
Okay.
Let's just say any bank that was having problems,
Yes.
all the other investment banks were pitching to try to be able to do business for them,
Yes.
to help them raise money or to sell themselves. So I was very much in that, and everything felt like a fire drill. It was an emergency.
So just a reminder for the people who don't remember this, but 2008, can you describe a little bit on what happened? Because it was a financial collapse, we could say.
It was a financial collapse, and the financial institutions in that time, because of let's just say a mortgage crisis.
Yes. It turned out that there was a bubble in the housing market, right?
That's a good summary. A bubble in the housing market, and that had a ripple effect on the entire economy. But being in New York, which is a financial hub, there was a lot of stress around that time. So that was the beginning of my career. I went from a liberal arts education at Princeton. I was also a college tennis player, so that was my world.
Yes.
And then I went into investment banking during the 2008 crisis. Quite a contrast in many ways. And it was much more challenging than I thought it was going to be. People warned me that investment banking was tough, but it was a different level of intensity and lack of sleep, let's just say. That was the norm. But that's just how the business goes. But I will say, I'll give some context here because we're going to move into the realm of where I am now.
Yeah.
I didn't have a sense of why anything mattered when I was doing it. I was just in the business world because I wanted to succeed and accomplish things. And this was a prestigious thing to do, to work in investment banking in New York. So that seemed like a good thing, but I didn't have any deeper meaning or purpose behind it. And I think without that deeper meaning, it makes the challenges more difficult. And that's a theme that continued for me. So I left this job in New York in 2010. So as the market was starting to stabilize a little bit, I knew I didn't want to do that anymore. And I joined a firm where I ended up spending 10 years. First in Boston for about 18 months, and then the majority of my time was in Silicon Valley. And this was a company that helps advise other companies on their intellectual property, their patents, their new innovations, but also the strategy around that from a business standpoint. So I worked with companies, number one, all over the world, but also in every industry, because every industry is innovating. And that was very interesting to me. But I was also working very hard, and I still didn't have this sense of meaning or purpose. I didn't know why I was doing it. And then in life, there were some curveballs. So some business deals that didn't go the way that I wanted, some things in my personal life that didn't go the way that I wanted, and I felt very lost. So this was about 8 years ago, 2016, where it kind of came to a head. And I started listening to podcasts. I was not looking for anything new. I wasn't saying I need to find meaning or purpose. I actually thought science teaches us something, and that is that we live in a universe that doesn't have any meaning built into the fabric of reality. So we can try to create a meaning, like many spiritual traditions do or religions, but that's really just trying to rationalize. There's nothing built into it.
So when you say the universe doesn't have any purpose or meaning, the universe also has no intentions. Right?
Exactly.
Okay,
it's totally random.
Yeah.
So it's, there was a big bang 13.8 billion years ago. It started the universe, and then a bunch of molecules collided, and then a human being evolved, and we developed a brain, and it's all random. I mean, that's basically the story that science teaches us.
Yes.
So I thought anything that was a spiritual idea, that was just a superstition, and we had gone past that. That was my worldview. So with that worldview, it's more difficult, I find, to deal with challenges. But my thinking was, I'm not going to try to just come up with meaning. I'm just going to accept reality as it is. So that was kind of a pretty dark place to be, although I know there are many people in that space.
Yeah.
And I started listening to podcasts. Initially, it was just because I thought podcasts were really interesting. I remember a friend sent me a podcast on Tim Ferriss. He was interviewing Mark Andreessen, a famous venture capitalist. Yes. And I said, wow, this is amazing. You can listen to these smart people all over the world talk for hours right on your phone. Yep. So I started listening to more podcasts. I started listening to alternative health because Tim Ferriss did a little bit of that. And he would say, he talked about psychedelics and meditation and things like that. So I actually experimented with some of the things he talked about, not the psychedelics, but he talked about sensory deprivation tanks, where you get in a tank of salt water, and there's so much salt that your body actually floats, and you just sit in the darkness. So I said, I'm going to try that. It was sort of like a meditation, and I felt things in my body, but nothing major happened. So I was in that experimental phase, and that led me to listen to alternative health podcasts. And there was one in particular, it's still on the air, called Extreme Health Radio. And they interviewed many people on how they heal from cancer and alternative treatments. But they interviewed one woman who talked about psychic abilities that she was using with her clients. Her name is Laura Powers. And I remember being intrigued because I hadn't heard anyone talk about that seriously. I mean, I heard science fiction movies, but not someone saying, I actually do this for a living and I'm helping people. And at the end of that episode, Laura said that she has her own podcast called Healing Powers. And I said, okay, well, I'm listening to lots of podcasts. Why don't I listen to this one? And on her podcast, she was interviewing many people who had these experiences from all over the world, from different backgrounds. And I was so confused because I said, wait, I've never heard of this before. These people have a totally different view of reality. They're saying there is something meaningful, but I thought there was no meaning. I know a lot of smart people who say there's no meaning. What's going on? So I was in this confused state because it was sort of a dark period, and now I was being presented with a totally different worldview. I didn't have anyone to speak with about it, and I just kept listening to her podcasts. And I'm reminded right now, because there were many moments that kind of jolted me more than others. There wasn't one big one, but there were a few smaller ones. One was I listened to Laura's podcast. She interviewed a man named Paul Davids, who is a Hollywood producer. He produced the Transformers, for example, and some well-known things. He was on Laura's show talking about experiences he had with his colleague in Hollywood who passed away. And this man was an atheist. And he said, look, to Paul, if I die, I don't think there's any afterlife, but if there is one, I'm going to drop you a line and let you know. Okay? So, and Paul actually graduated from Princeton, and he was in the same major as me. So I said, okay, I'm going to listen to this guy because he has a similar background. And he told these incredible stories of, which he's written a book about this called An Atheist in Heaven. He produced a documentary about this as well, where, for example, he was in a home by himself looking through papers, and he left the room for a little bit and came back, and the paper had a few words crossed out in wet ink that he did not put on the ink. And he said, what's going on here? Because the words that were crossed out had meaning relative to the man who had died. He sent with his own money, sent the ink to chemistry labs, and there were weird things in the chemical composition. That's just one example. He gives example after example. So I'm hearing all of these different anecdotes. That's my point, is there's Paul Davids from Princeton talking about this, then another person, and I'm saying, what is going on here?
So in these moments, your old paradigm is slowly being shattered in a way.
Completely shattered. My context for being alive, what is a human being? I was starting to ask those questions. And I was thinking to myself, are there parts of myself that no one told me about, and parts of you and every other person that we're just not aware of? Because now in hindsight, it feels like I was almost a zombie, just going through the motions because I learned things in school and I had certain goals because of what other people around me said. But now I was learning new things that challenged it. So it was a crazy time.
So could you, with our audience, share some insights that you had? Old paradigm versus the new paradigm.
Yes. And let me preface this by saying I was not planning on writing books at this time. I was just curious. Old paradigm versus new paradigm. One is remote viewing. Okay? This is a phenomenon.
Absolutely.
Where go ahead.
Very important. I've been teaching remote viewing now for 12 years. I've been a remote viewer for 22 years. But for the people who've never heard of it, we know that the Russians are doing it, the Chinese government is doing it, the American government is still doing it. For newbies, what exactly is remote viewing?
I had never heard of remote viewing when I learned about it. It's the ability to perceive something with your mind that's far away in space and or time. So that means you can basically psychically see something in the past, the present, the future with your mind, and it can be anywhere. It's as if the mind does not abide by laws of space and time, that it can be anywhere at all times. And like you said, because I was skeptical of all this at first. I said, how could this be? I learned from very smart professors at Princeton in the psychology department. We didn't learn about this. There must be something strange here. And then I learned about the US government's program.
But at the time when you were in Princeton, you still have peer. And you have people like Roger Nelson who are aware of remote viewing. So, you were not aware of people like Roger Nelson at the time you were at Princeton?
That's a very good point. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. This was run by Dr. Robert John, who was the Dean of Engineering at Princeton. Very prominent person. I never knew it existed when I was there.
So it was like a secretive lab almost.
I think it was.
Yeah.
And what I understand, so I produced a podcast series in 2019 called Where Is My Mind? And I interviewed Brenda Dunn, who co-ran the program with Dr. John, who passed away, and also Roger Nelson. And my impression from talking to them is that Princeton was not very happy with this lab. But because Dr. John was so prominent, they allowed him to do it. And he was looking at remote viewing, among other things, which we'll probably talk about.
Yeah, and the power of consciousness.
The power of consciousness, meaning the mind can actually have an impact on the world, even though the mind isn't physical, which I know sounds crazy.
So why was Princeton not so happy with this particular kind of research?
It counters the paradigm.
The old paradigm, yeah.
Because if the mind can do things outside of space and time, what does that tell us about our physics, about psychology, about neuroscience, about what a human being is, philosophy, everything?
So could we say that if at Princeton they don't want the students to know about this research lab peer, that there's, we could say in our society, a conspiracy to not let us know what our real psychic powers are and who we really are. Do you agree with that?
I agree with you now. I think when I first started, my impression was, well, this is just about the egos of the professors, because they learned one way and they've been writing papers their whole career, and they don't want something that's going to show that they were wrong. And I think that might be true to an extent, but what you're saying, I think, is really the core of it. That there's something that's trying to suppress knowledge. And we've seen this in other areas of the world too. This was just my first entry point. And you're reminding me of an interview it was on a podcast called Skeptico with Dr. Mario Beauregard. He's a neurologist who studies these sorts of phenomena. And he was told by the head of his institute in Canada, a prominent neurological institute, as long as I'm alive, they said to him, you will not be able to study phenomena like this. And what his opinion was, is that this is social engineering, to try to engineer the students and just the population in general toward one worldview when actually truth is something else.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, if you are the Chinese government, if you are the Russian government, if you are the American government, and you actually invest millions in the education of psychic spies, paranormal spies, then you don't want the normal public to be able to tap into those same powers, because you lose your edge in a way, right? So maybe that's also a reason why. So let's dive a little bit more into remote viewing and its background. So I think remote viewing in, let's say, the American world started when they figured out, I think in Washington DC, that the Russians were educating psychic spies. And then they decided to approach two people in particular. I think it's Hal Puthoff, a laser physicist, and Russell Targ, to start at that time at Stanford Research Institute to look for people in, let's say, the Western world who also had those same kinds of powers in order to start a unit of psychic spies against the Russians in a way, in the framework of the Cold War, right? So one of the first people that was invited to Stanford Research Institute was Uri Geller, and you still have footage on the internet where Uri Geller was at Stanford Research Institute back, I think, in 72 or 73, a young Uri Geller, and they do all kinds of tests with him. They put things in a box or things in an envelope, and he's able to identify what's in the envelope and so on. Later on, they invite someone like Ingo Swann, who basically becomes the father of remote viewing, together with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. And they start this remote viewing protocol, if you will, and they start to educate American soldiers into the protocol of remote viewing. Is this a little bit the background of remote viewing in the Western world?
Yeah, that's a great summary. I had never heard any of this background. I didn't know it existed until I heard about it on podcasts. But then I started looking into some of the documents that had been released. So these are declassified documents. They used to be private, now they're publicly available. And I'll give you some quotations from the documents. They say, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. These are documents that are out there. And it was also very powerful for me when I spoke with Uri Geller and Russell Targ on my podcast, Where's My Mind? Because when I speak with people who are in it, there's no doubt. For me, I was doubting and questioning, is this real? No, these are people who are doing it and actually seeing it happening. And to them, it's actually practical. So what Uri Geller told me is, he said, look, at that time, that we didn't have the technology to be able to see things far away for government purposes. So one of the famous examples that Jimmy Carter, former US president, admitted is real, is there was a downed Russian bomber in an African jungle somewhere. It was lost. And the radar systems could not find it. So they used remote viewers, psychic spies, to locate it with their mind alone. These are stories that are, you know, they blow up the paradigm of modern science. Just one example, that should never happen under the current paradigm, but it's actually being used, and over $20 million were invested in Stargate alone. That's what Russell Targ told me.
Yes.
This was a serious project, and like you say, there's a lot happening that we don't know and that is not publicly available.
Another thing that happened when Jimmy Carter was president, and this was told to me by Paul H. Smith, was that the Americans had nuclear weapons, I think, and they wanted to hide them from the Russians, but they wanted the American remote viewers to see if they could find the nuclear rockets through remote viewing, and they were able to locate them. So they said, okay, there's no point in trying to hide them from the Russians, because if the American remote viewers are able to find the nuclear weapons, then the Russian remote viewers must also be able to find them. So they decided to stop that nuclear program at the time. So this is all happening, of course, in the time of the Cold War. The interesting thing, if you look at Russell Targ, years ago he was doing a TEDx, and it was immediately banned. And all the TEDx was about his research into remote viewing and all the work he did into remote viewing. Have you any idea why this research this research talk basically was banned?
Yeah, well, my understanding is that the implications of that research, it goes so strongly against the scientific paradigm that many mainstream outlets will not allow it. So another example is Rupert Sheldrake's TEDx talk. Has had similar problems, and Graham Hancock. So people who are challenging the paradigm of consciousness, meaning our capacity for experience, the things that we experience in our mind. That's what I mean by consciousness. If the current paradigm, and this is what I used to believe, is that consciousness just comes from our brain and it kind of pops out. And when your brain dies, that's the end of your consciousness. Consciousness is stuck in your skull. It doesn't go anywhere in space and time. And here we have people who not only have scientific evidence that we've seen in peer-reviewed studies, but actually governments using it for practical purposes. That destroys the paradigm, because now we have to rethink consciousness. We have to rethink what it means to be a human being. And what it seems like is that there are certain platforms that will not allow that because it challenges too much.
Yeah. So is it also maybe because when we are not aware of who we really are, if we are not aware of our psychic powers, then we're more easily to control?
I think that's a good way to put it, because this view that we're talking about today is very empowering for the individual. It means that anyone has it innately within you.
It means like we almost have godlike powers.
Exactly. And we haven't harnessed them, because many of us don't even know they exist. So we go through life, like I said, I was a zombie basically, not knowing there's this broader world out there that we can be tapping into. So let's just say there are people who, if they wanted to control the population, you'd want to try to suppress the empowerment of the individual to make them think, oh, well, I'm just this person and I live and I die and that's it. And I don't have any special abilities. What if that's not true?
Yes. So very interesting for our audience. This is accessible to anyone. It's like learning to ride a bike. Everyone can learn to ride a bike. Not everyone can win the Tour de France.
Right.
It's what, not everyone becomes a Mozart or a Roger Federer. Mozart was a genius in music. Roger Federer is a genius in tennis. Djokovic is a genius in tennis. But we all have the capacity to learn this, to have a basic, to have basic skills basically in remote viewing. So remote viewing is a protocol that anyone can learn. So we all have the power to tap into those psychic powers. And if some people have a natural gift for this, and other people can learn this and can become better at this through making many flying hours, if you will. But I think it's really important, and I think Ingo Swan, the father of remote viewing, wanted to make this very clear. You have to believe that you can do this. If you don't believe it, you cannot do it. But anyone can learn remote viewing. It doesn't matter what your background is, because it's connected to the consciousness that we are, right?
Yeah, there's an important distinction here that a common counter argument is, well, someone tried to remote view something and they didn't get it right, therefore it's all bogus.
Yes.
That's not how it works, as you know very well. That 100% performance is very rare.
Absolutely.
But what happens is that people do things beyond what chance would predict.
Yes.
So it's statistical, and the degree to which they perform well could be based on talent or how much they've actually trained. So there's a spectrum of abilities. The whole point is that there should never be any examples of this being correct, ever, based on the current paradigm. If you have one example of it being correct, even if it's wrong sometimes, that still means a new paradigm.
Absolutely. If you look at the statistical research on remote viewing, take the work of Stephen Schwartz, who was working from Washington State University, then there is absolutely something going on here. And remote viewing really works. But if you're looking into the future, which you can do with remote viewing, you have to take into account that the future is not set in stone most of the time, unless the future event that you're looking at is rigged, right? So if the future event is not rigged, then it's not set in stone. So you can only see high probabilities into the future. That's what you can see. I noticed that in the investing world, and I work a lot with investors, that they are more forgiving when it comes to remote viewing data, because they work from a perspective of statistics almost. We were talking about Warren Buffett earlier in the car while we were driving up here. And from the 300 investments that he made, only 12 were successful. So he has a success rate of 4%. But that still made him the richest man in the world at the time. And if he wouldn't have given away the bulk of his fortune to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he still would be the richest guy in the world. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you have a few big winners also in remote viewing, then you're already successful. But the data from Russell Targ, from Al Puthoff, from Stephen Schwartz, and from many other remote viewing researchers points out that there is a psychic power that we all have that is able to help us see things that are not in the room here, that we can see things from a distance, and that we have the capacity to look into the future, right? If you look at near-death experiences, and it's really interesting, all near-death experiences point to a different dimension. Once we leave the body, we connect with a timeless awareness where we have 30-60 degree consciousness, where we can be anywhere just through our thinking. We can go anywhere and be anywhere. We experience ourselves as unconditional love, but also as infinite wisdom. So it seems that when we're in the body, that we experience ourselves from a different perspective. Once we leave the body, we experience ourselves as infinite wisdom, unconditional love. So we are both at the same time. We are that infinite wisdom, unconditional love, and at the same time, when we're in the body, we become, we identify with the vantage point. You are Mark Gober, you're an American, and you experience yourself as finite. But when you have the near-death experience, you experience yourself as infinite. How do you live in those two worlds, actually? People who have this near-death experience, when they come back into the body, they feel like they're going into a container that's basically too small for the consciousness that they are.
And often they will change their jobs,
yes,
or they'll get divorced because
yes,
their worldview shifts so
yes,
dramatically.
Yes.
And this is a phenomenon that also changed my worldview. Not just the remote viewing, near-death experience was a big one because there's so many prominent doctors and scientists who have looked at this. So Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, Dr. Pim van Lommel,
I know him, yeah.
Dutch cardiologist, and he published a paper with a number of other authors in the Lancet Medical Journal that talks about these near-death experiences in cardiac arrest survivors. So these are people who are clinically dead, blood stops flowing to the brain after a certain amount of time, meaning that their brain is off, and if it's on in any way, it's some minute amount. And yet they have an experience that they say is realer than real in terms of their consciousness. And this should never happen in a cardiac arrest case, and yet it was nearly 20% of the participants. So not everyone, but there should be 0%. What's going on? So people come back from these experiences, and they've seen a reality that's not the one that we are in our body on an everyday basis. So the challenge becomes how to integrate that. And I'm trying to do this myself. I think we all are to some degree because I haven't had a near-death experience. Some people, when they do psychedelics, they will report something somewhat similar, or meditation. There are other ways that it can happen. It can happen spontaneously for some people, but it's a similar adjustment of, wait, there's this vastness to my identity of my consciousness, and now I'm in a body. So it's almost like, at least for me, acknowledging the limitations of the body, but then in my mind, just being reminded that there's something that my body is not perceiving. And we know this even from a traditional perspective, looking at the electromagnetic spectrum of light. We only see a tiny little fraction of all the light that's out there. There are all kinds of light like infrared and X-rays. There's a massive spectrum that we can't see with our eyes. So when we think about it that way, or even our auditory spectrum, we can't hear everything, all the different frequencies. So there's a lot more than meets the eye.
You also, I know Pim van Lommel. He says that the mind is actually an interface for the soul. When we are in a state of heart coherence, if you have studied the work of HeartMath, when we are in heart coherence, that's when we experience love and gratitude, and the brain opens up, and left and right brain start to work together more, and it's easier for us to receive intuitive information. So the more loving we become, the more intelligent we become, because our brain opens up. But he says that the brain is an interface for our higher self. Also very interesting is, of course, the work of Ibn Alexander, Proof of Heaven. Can you elaborate a little bit on his work?
Yeah, he was a Harvard neurosurgeon. And he had a near-death experience. He was in a coma for an extended period of time, and he also had an elaborate experience. One of the most remarkable aspects was that he saw a woman in this state. I believe she was on a butterfly or something like that. And he later found out when he was resuscitated, he saw a picture of his, it was a deceased sister, and it was the same as the person in the near-death experience state that he had never seen before. So there's some strange things where people will experience things in the near-death state that can be validated when they're resuscitated. That's very hard to explain because some people will say, look, yeah, the near-death experience happens, but it's just because the brain is spitting off chemicals and it's a hallucination. But if someone has a memory that can be verified when they're resuscitated, that means it's not a hallucination. So what is then going on? So Ibn Alexander is a great example because his whole life changed, like many others. He became, he's a famous author now. Another really interesting case, Daniel Brinkley, who I also interviewed on my podcast.
He died many times, I think, like 9 times or something.
Like he had 4 near-death experiences. He was struck by lightning, open heart surgery twice, and brain surgery. So for him, he had some remarkable aspects. He had a life review in his experience, which 20 to 30% of people report, where he relived his whole life in a short amount of time, but he also became each person that he impacted during his life. Meaning, when he was in Vietnam in combat, because he fought in the Vietnam War, he killed people, and he experienced in the life review what it was like to be the person that he killed through that person's eyes. He also got to feel what it was like to be the children who would no longer have fathers because he killed their fathers in combat. So when he came back from that experience, everything changed. His priorities shifted. He became a hospice volunteer, helping people in the death process. So at the time, of course, he didn't know he would have near-death experiences again, because that's a very rare thing to almost die multiple times. But in those later near-death experiences, he also had life reviews, which started from the beginning of his life, he told me, and he got to experience the new things. He got to experience what it was like to be the person dying and being comforted by him and what that was like. So now he goes all around the world telling people this, and he says, look, it's very selfish of me to tell other people because I know we're going to experience a life review, and now I get to experience the way in which all of you are going to shift through my positive actions. So that's a very big shift, because I mean, think about where I was. I wasn't thinking about a life review or that my actions mattered. In the near-death state, that's what seems to be the case.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. If you look at all these near-death experiences, I think they're the best way to understand why we are here and what's really important. So what are your biggest takeaways after studying near-death experiences? If you would speak to humanity, you would say, okay, this is really important after having studied near-death experiences.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give one caveat before I answer it, because this is a theme that's come up a lot, and I can't validate this or dispute it. But some people wonder, in these other realms of consciousness, if there can be elements of deception, of advanced intelligences that actually can give us messages that are not true in some cases. So we always have to take things with a grain of salt, because we just don't know this other world. But I do think there are some positive aspects that are hard, that feel like it can't be bad to adopt some of this stuff. Like to treat people well. That's one example. So some call it the golden rule. Treat other people well because we're interconnected in our consciousness. That's
we're all one.
That's what people say in the life review and the near-death experience. They all come back with that. So that's one idea, that there's an interconnectedness, a oneness that we don't experience on a day-to-day basis because it feels like we're separate. And that's the paradox. Interconnected but separate. So let's say the oneness is one. Another is unconditional love. They all say it. I know it kind of sounds like it's like from a movie or something, but that's what people come back saying, is that there is a level of lovingness that can't be put into words. They actually say that over and over again. We can't describe it with language, but this is what happens. And by the way, there are children who have near-death experiences who've had no cultural influences that talk about this. People throughout history have talked about it. So there are people who have been blind since birth, have similar experiences. So there's a commonality that's very important. So unconditional love is another one. But then also they're talking about things like a soul. That was language that I thought was superstitious. They're talking about that as if it's a real thing and that there's actual purpose and meaning to our lives. And that's when the light bulb went off for me.
And the soul has intentions.
It has intentions, that we're here to do something, and that there's a purpose and a direction that we should be headed towards. And when we're not headed in that direction, actually, there might be things in our life that can be painful, that can steer us in a new direction.
So if you look at this, you have the personality and you have the soul. If your personality wants to be, let's say, an investment banker, but your soul wants to be a researcher, let's say, then you have an inner conflict. And I think the soul is more powerful than the personality because the soul is your true identity. What happens when you have this inner conflict of the personality wants to go to the left and the soul wants to go to the right?
What seems to happen, there are patterns that people have described, and what we can infer is that life can become challenging, and there might be suffering that we experience. I think that's what happened to me in hindsight, that I was going in a direction that was probably not right for my soul, and life was becoming more and more difficult until it got so difficult that I was like a zombie, and then I had this awakening to new things, and then I felt much more aligned.
A lot of people in our time are living like zombies, like the living dead. What can we do in order to have a world where more people are starting to connect with their soul?
I think there are two basic categories. One is direct experience, like a near-death experience, although the challenge is you might die, and it's not a pleasant thing.
Flatliners.
Flatliners,
there's a risk,
Yeah, there's a big risk with the near-death experience. So there are other things people can do, like meditation or breathing exercises. There are many different genres, and for each person it might be something different. And then the other one, which has been perhaps more of my path, is the knowledge path of actually learning about these things. Because what I find is that actually learning new things opens my consciousness, meaning that I see the world in a new way, and then my life seems to shift. I know that might sound crazy, but I've seen it happen so many times, and many other people experience the same thing. So there's value. Let's say just some of your viewers who listen to this conversation, by being exposed to the material, there might be a shift in their life. And then what I find is the more I expose myself, the more life shifts, and then I seem to align better.
If you look at the near-death experience of Anita Moorjani, a woman from Hong Kong, she went up into the light, and one of the biggest takeaways that she came back with was that we have to treasure our own magnificence, and that when we align or connect with the energy of our soul, then everything that truly is ours will come to us without any effort, will come to us effortlessly. So it seems to be that, what Jesus said, if you seek the kingdom of heaven first, then all else will be added unto you. And Eckhart Tolle said, if you get the inside right, the outside will fall into place. So if we are really this infinite consciousness, this unconditional love, then that's God consciousness. We should not suffer or have real trouble or problems manifesting things in our lives, because if you're God consciousness, you can do that effortlessly, easily. Then we go into things like synchronicities. I mean, that's a word coined by Carl Jung, and synchronicities are those experiences where we experience something and first we maybe think, okay, this is a coincidence, but we feel that there's purpose, there's power, there's meaning behind it. Since you have been on this path, have you experienced synchronicities, and can you give examples?
Yeah, that was actually one of the first things I experienced. As soon as I started listening to podcasts, I was having very strange coincidences where, so one example was I was producing my podcast series, and it was called Where Is My Mind? And I ran into one of my old college friends who I hadn't seen in years, and he was actually just visiting San Francisco. And I mentioned that I had a new podcast series. So the fact that I even saw him was so strange, but I mentioned the name of it, and he said, that's very bizarre because I walked down the aisle of my wedding to that song, Where Is My Mind? And that was the name of my podcast. So that was just one example. I was taking notes of them every day because there were so many. And I was trying to do the math in my head, or what's the probability that this could just be a chance occurrence? And when it happens so much, it seems like there's an intelligence involved.
Yes. And we can tap into that intelligence. Right.
We can.
Yes.
And we have, but the intention and the belief is important. And I think because there's so much scientific evidence, it's not blind faith belief. It's actually rational.
Yes.
So having the belief and then actually setting in motion everything. So there can be this paradox of saying, well, everything's going to be taken care of for me, and then saying, well, I'm going to sit on the couch and watch TV all day. There has to be some activeness, not just passivity.
Yes.
So for example, when I write books now, I see this mystical pattern too, where I synchronistically learn about one thing and then another, and then all of a sudden I'm writing a book. There's still a lot of effort that goes into it.
Yes.
Even though it feels smooth, I have to wake up, I have to sit in front of the computer for hours, I have to research for hours.
You have to do the work,
I have to do the work, but there's like a guiding force that's making it more seamless.
Yes, and this guiding force speaks to you in energy. I think a good sign, if you want to know if you're in tune with that soul, is the experience of flow. When we experience flow, we are in this timeless experience where we really love to do something and we forget about time. We're really fully engaged in a task. I think that flow is a very good way to measure your alignment with the soul. You know, when do you feel really good? When do you feel excited? When do you feel joy? That's when you are in alignment with your true essence, which is the soul. I believe that the work that we're doing is important because, like you said, someone can watch this podcast and say, wow, something is shifting inside of me. Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. I think the best thing we can do is speak our truth, do our research, speak our truth, and be a counterforce to the information that's out there from the mainstream media. You wrote a few books. The first book that I read was your first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. And you used that title for many other books. What can you tell me? Because there's one book about freedom, there's one book about the pharmaceutical industry. Can we dive into that a little bit? Because you are talking about so many different subjects. What do our listeners and our viewers need to know about freedom and the pharmaceutical industry?
There's so much. Well, let me start with to tie it with consciousness, because that's part of the reason all the books have to do with upside down. Is first of all, the paradigm in, I think, politics and elsewhere is upside down, but there's also a thread of incorporating consciousness into our thinking. Because let's say in the political world, are people talking about consciousness and the golden rule and near-death experience? I mean, shouldn't, if the nature of reality is a certain way and government is structuring our society, shouldn't there be some kind of a link? So in the book, there's a number of more traditional political and economic things I talk about, but I also tie in the golden rule, because that's what, like Dr. Bruce Grayson, University of Virginia, a professor emeritus, he's saying, look, I'm interviewing all these near-death experience survivors, and when they have a life review, they're talking about something that's even beyond morality, that it's natural law, that this interconnectedness, the oneness. So if we think about how politics works, is that really what's going on?
It's divide and conquer.
It's not the golden rule at all.
So the golden rule, just to make it clear for our audience, is we're all connected, we're all one. Is that the golden rule?
And the golden rule is the consequence of that, which is treat other people the way you want to be treated.
So and is that what karma is? What you send out, you'll get back?
Some people have likened it to that, the life review, where you feel the negative and the positive of what you've given. So like Daniel Brinkley, he has multiple near-death experiences. He became each person, and he got to feel the effects of his actions on them, the good and the bad. So shouldn't we then structure society around that to try to leave people's property alone and allow them to make decisions on their own versus forcing people? So even like, let's say, taxation. You go out and you work hard, you earn money, and then the government says, well, I'm going to take some of that and give it to the things that we think are important, versus allowing you to do that on your own. They're taking your property that you might not want to give. That's just one example. That would be a violation of the golden rule, which we're hearing is natural law. So it's like politics, as we do it in the modern world, violates basic principles about how reality works.
So you've seen the Avatar film. Let's talk about the first film. You've got the Na'vi, the blue people, who are living in alignment with nature, and then you've got the humanity, the real people that want resources from the place they live, and it's underneath the big holy tree. But at the end of the movie, nature steps in and wipes out the people that want the resources. Do you believe that there is a natural energy that will cleanse out all the things that are not in alignment with the golden rule?
I want to believe that's true, but the timeline in which it happens might be very long, and there could be suffering in between. So let's give one example, is the whole COVID period, starting 2020. There were many things that happened that we could say that was very bad. It caused suffering, people lost their jobs, and so forth. But how many people did it wake up to what's going on in the world? It shook everything up. I know in my journey, many of my books came after COVID, things I didn't know about previously that led me to look at politics. I didn't even look at politics. I was not concerned about that when I worked in Wall Street. And then COVID happened, and it made me look into politics. So that's just one example of me, and I'm sure many members of your audience can resonate with that, of wow, we at least started asking new questions. So that might be what happens, is that we're forced basically to align and it moved toward the goodness, but they can be uncomfortable in the meantime.
Yeah, if you look at what's happening in our world, especially since COVID, is that they're through social engineering, they're trying to move us into a more, let's say, communistic society. They want cashless money, they want 15-minute cities, they want less freedom of speech. I think in the future, when you have an opinion that's not in congruency with what the government wants, there will be sanctions, like you cannot use your blockchain money because we will live in a cashless society. You will not be able to buy certain goods that you need. If you are not a law-abiding citizen, then there will be all kinds of consequences. And it's easier to enforce them when we are in a cashless society, because when everything is on the blockchain, it's easier to control you. It's also easier from a fiscal point of view, of course. Everything that is on the blockchain is traceable. It's like a big ledger. The administrators of the world who are rolling this out, they seem to be not in alignment with what you call the golden rule. How will this all play out?
Well, I will say that they often weaponize the idea of compassion.
Yeah.
They'll say, well, we're just doing these things to protect you.
Yes.
So there's an important thing I use in my books, compassion with discernment.
Yes.
Because you could have someone who says, look, we're all one, therefore you shouldn't be able to own any property and someone should be able to walk in your home and get on your couch.
Yeah.
Basically a communistic idea, which sounds really nice because it sounds compassionate. But in practice, we've seen that it's led to murders, many, many murders. So that's an important part of this. And in terms of where it's playing out and where this is going to go, because it does seem to me that there is an agenda, an ideology that's being imposed on the world where some people want to control others.
Yes.
And it's going to be up to our discernment to be able to see through it. When they say, look, this is all very benevolent. One of my books is on the Great Reset. It's called An End to the Upside Down Reset was my book, where in 2020, Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum and his colleague Thierry Malloret wrote a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset.
Yep.
And it talks about basically a new shaping of society. And when I look at it, I say, wow, this sounds very tyrannical, where some people want to centralize power and control everything and digitize and have surveillance. But the way it's positioned is not that. It's, well, there's a climate crisis. We need to do things about that. And when there's a medical emergency, we need to actually control things more.
They're trying to sell you their agenda, of course.
To sell the agenda.
Yep.
And where I see things playing out is it's up to us, each individual, to see through it and to have the discernment to say, is there compassionate, that they're calling compassion, is it actually compassionate? Or are they fooling us? Is it like a wolf in sheep's clothing?
Yeah, Mickey Willis, who did the pandemic films, he calls this weaponized compassion.
Yes.
So they're using our compassion against it. Oh, we have to save Granny, and because we have to save Granny, we have to align with all these mandates that we really don't like, right?
Exactly.
And it all started, I think, in our time with 9/11. All of a sudden, they had to check everything at the airport, and now they're moving forward with all these mandates. And at one point, we become used to it, and it's, I think, for me, sometimes I really think we are like sheep because it's so easy for us to agree with it. Sometimes I'm really amazed by the lack of protest. I mean, how do you experience that?
Well, we've been so conditioned since being young children, basically, that the authority figures are the experts. They know what's best. These medical interventions, vaccines are good. All these things that we just hold as assumptions now.
Yeah.
And it's challenging to go outside and say, wait, could it be that all these people who I respected so much are lying? And maybe they're not even lying. Maybe they're just giving information because they think it's true and they've been misled.
Yes.
So you have to step outside the box and ask questions. The way I think about it is, anything that I believe to be true, I'm asking myself constantly, why do I think that's true? Where did I hear the information? Let me go to that source. Where did that source come from? And look at the full chain of knowledge and information. And what I find over and over again is that many things that I thought were true, just because I assumed it was true, they aren't. And then that leaves us in a very uncomfortable position. Absolutely. Because we're getting messages from the media and from the education system telling us one thing with certainty. And then over here, there's information that's countering that. So we have to be free thinkers and say, actually, they're not telling the truth. And I'm not going to listen to it because it could be harmful. And it's going to be up to us as individuals to make those decisions.
If you look at how our society is organized, you could look at a McDonald's franchise. You have a pyramid, and you have the upper management, and you have middle management, and you have all the McDonald's franchises all over the world. Mm-hmm. So the people who are in the local McDonald's restaurant, they don't know what's going on in the upper echelons of McDonald's. Only the people at the very top know what the agenda is. The rest are just people who are, rolling out the agenda, but they don't know why or what's the intention behind it. If you look at the Bill Gateses and the Klaus Schwabs of the world and all the people who are empowering government, the Kamala Harrises and the Joe Bidens, they seem to have quote-unquote overlords, but they are not visible to us. But it seems to be orchestrated because every political leader seems to speak from the same script, and that's terrifying if you start to study that. How is it structured? How is it organized, according to your research?
I wish I knew. It's one of the hardest things to discern. Because I experienced this when I worked in investment banking in New York. I was at the bottom of the totem pole. I was told, we're doing this presentation for this company, create a price chart, compare all the companies' stock prices, things like that. So I was just doing the data, but I didn't know where the orders were coming from or who was, I didn't know the context. So I can understand how we end up in a world where there are a few powerful people who pull the strings and other people have to listen. But during COVID, we saw for the first time, at least probably for the first time ever, so clearly, where the entire world was shut down on the basis of a few assumptions about what SARS-CoV-2 is, and I talk about this in my medicine book, and how dangerous the symptoms were. And we saw people acting in unison, where the politicians were saying the same things. And then there was a vaccine rollout, and we're told the same things. We're not allowed to ask questions about whether it's safe. We're not even allowed to ask, what are the ingredients? They would call you an anti-vaxxer if you asked what's in this vaccine. So my guess is that there's a small number of people who know all of these things, but you could have even people at high levels who don't know the full picture, who are just being told to do X, Y, and Z. And then when you throw in complex aspects like blackmail and bribery and threats and even mind control technology, you could have people who are not even acting out of their own will in some ways. They're acting because they have to or because they've been programmed to do so. And that complicates the whole picture.
We talked about the fact that some people have become zombies or are zombies. There's people that experience things and it insults in a way their soul, and there are people who are very compliant. How do you explain this difference?
Well, my sense is that when people are acting fully in accordance with their soul, there's a smoothness to it, and there's an inner knowing that that's true. Whereas there's probably less happiness overall when in the zombie state. And I experienced this myself because I was there, where there was a sense of meaninglessness and I was just going through the motions, but I didn't know anything else, almost like being in a movie set. And I can see this because I came from that world and I still know people in that world. And sometimes when I look in their eyes almost, I identify with it. I say, I know where you are now because I was there. And there's a lack of lightness that comes out of the eyes.
Yes.
Have you experienced that too? It's like...
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a lawyer, I felt cut off from my aliveness. And when I started The Power of the Heart, when I started to produce the film, although it was very challenging, I started to feel alive. The colors came back into my life. Before that, I experienced everything as very gray. So when we start to live from the guidance of our soul, our life becomes colorful again. We feel alive. We feel that we're being guided by a greater force, and we feel the sense of purpose and meaning.
And that would have been so hard for me to believe when I was in my old state of... I would have said, Baptiste, that sounds great, but that can't be true.
Yes, but now it's your own experience.
It's my lived experience.
Yes.
And I've met so many people. That's the other thing, is my network shifted so much. I was the only person. And then when I started to speak publicly, because like I said, I was researching just for my own benefit. And then I decided about a year into my research in 2017, I'm going to put this into a book, which was then published in 2018, and End to Upside Down Thinking. But since I've done that, I've met so many people. Since I've aligned fully and said, I'm going to go with this, I'm meeting new people who are aligned with me. And each book I've written has been a new paradigm where I'm always a little nervous. I say, can I really write about this? But then I do it and I have the evidence to back up what I'm saying. And then this whole world opens up of like-minded people. Yes. So we have to take that initiative. We have to be active and then at the same time allow the world to come to us. It's a paradox.
Yes, I think the more we become who we really are, and I mean by that our true identity, the soul, the more we start to attract people into our lives who are like us. You know, you don't attract what you want, you attract who you are.
Yes. Right?
So it's a mirror, basically. If you are more becoming who you really are, you will attract more people who are authentic.
Right. You're reminding me of an analogy. I've kind of created this from hearing so many different spiritual teachers, that we can look at what's happening in our life, take like an inventory of everything in our life, our relationships, where we are, the people, our job, and it's a reflection in some ways of our inner state.
Yes.
So we can measure where we are in our internal world by what's happening externally to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So your book about the pharmaceutical industry, what are the biggest takeaways?
Well, I'll start with consciousness because there's so much there.
Yes.
The allopathic approach to medicine, which is how medicine is done now in the West.
Yes. So allopathic for our viewers,
Yeah,
what does
this
it
is
mean?
basically looking at the symptoms rather than the root cause of why someone is sick, and also having a reductionistic perspective, meaning looking at everything from a physical standpoint rather than looking at these more spiritual topics of consciousness. And since 1910, there was a report called the Flexner Report. And anyone can look this up. It's a very thick document. And it was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, which changed medicine. It's led us away from what we now call alternative. Back in the day, it was not alternative. It was just natural healing. Things like homeopathy, osteopathic approaches. These things still exist, but they're much less mainstream. And now the medical schools have the more allopathic approach, which is the pharmaceuticals and so forth. And the allopathic system is influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, which influences not only the media, but the politicians and the med schools. So we end up with a system that's supposed to treat our health, but it's actually incentivized to keep us sick and keep us on medications.
Yes, because it's a money-making system.
It's from a business standpoint, it makes sense. If you're selling products that are dependent on people being sick, you want them to be sick. And you don't want people to cure their illness. You want them to have to be on medication for their whole lives. That's just from an economic standpoint. That's how it works. So we've been steered in this reductionistic allopathic system. It's just looking at the symptoms, not looking at the root cause as much. And certainly not incorporating consciousness in the way that we're talking about it. So I'll go back to Anita Moorjani, one of my favorite examples, who I mentioned in the book. She had a near-death experience when she was in a coma, dying of cancer. She had tumors all over her body.
The size of lemons. Yeah.
I mean, she was going to be dead.
Yep.
And in her near-death experience, she had shifts in her consciousness. Not just unconditional love, but she realized things about herself that she was not nice enough to herself, not enough self-compassion, and many other things, which she's written about. And then when she was resuscitated, shortly thereafter, her tumors disappeared.
Yes. Within 48 hours, they were gone.
And the doctors couldn't understand it.
Yes, and they told her, just because it's not there anymore, it doesn't mean you're cured from cancer, but she knew better. Right? The interesting thing is that when she was in the light, obviously she wanted to stay there. She didn't want to go back to this body which was really ill. And she said, no, I'm not going back. But they told her, you have to go back because you have a mission. And because she was in a timeless awareness, she could see that if she would go back to her body, she would be healed within 48 hours. And that's why she decided to go back.
And to think about the implications of that there's some intelligence that is able to inform that we're not accessing on a day-to-day basis. This just blows up the paradigm of everything, including medicine.
Yes.
So what does that mean? That physical symptoms that you could see in the body, actual tumors, disappear without a physical intervention.
Yes.
The only thing that changed was her consciousness.
So consciousness is the ultimate healer.
That's the implication.
Yeah. So how do we align with that consciousness while we're still in the body? We cannot all have this out-of-body experience or this near-death experience.
I think a big part of it is looking at our beliefs and our thoughts. Sometimes those are conscious beliefs, but sometimes they're subconscious. So it's like looking at when we get upset or we feel stress in our body, thinking, well, what's causing that? Is there something in my life that's not in alignment? Or is there a belief I have that might not actually be true, that I'm still believing? The work of Byron Katie is very valuable here. It's called The Work, where basically if you have a belief, you write it down, and it's something that's uncomfortable.
You ask yourself if this is really true.
Is it true? And then the second question is, can I absolutely know that this belief is true? And what do you find every time? Well, actually, I can't know for sure. And that helps because we're all suffering in different ways because of things we believe that are not as true as we believe them to be. And then we have to ask the question, what is that doing to our health?
Yes. So we can do all this stuff, meditation, look at things that bring us into a state of flow, read biographies, books about people who experienced near-death experiences, because sometimes we first need to repeat certain information before we start to incorporate it, before we integrate it, because in the beginning it's, this sounds too good. If you look at Anita Moorjani's story, it sounds too good to be true, but it is true, right? More and more we start to discover who we really are. We start to peel off all the layers. If I look at my students in remote viewing, the biggest shift is that they start to say, my self-belief and my confidence is growing. The more you start to realize who you are, the more you start to realize what you're able to do, the more you start to tap into your psychic powers, the more you start to realize, oh my God, we are being confined in an identity that's much too small compared to who I really am. So this is all about empowerment. This is all about learning who you really are and what your real powers are, right?
It is, and I think you make a really important point that it doesn't always happen overnight in an instant. For some it can, and we hear about those because they're very sensational. Anita Morjani's story is incredible. But for some of us, and like me, it was more incremental.
Yes, step by step.
Step by step, and I would even revert back. So I would, let's say, listen to a lot of podcasts back in 2016, then go to work, have a full day with my clients, and kind of forget and say, that stuff can't be real. I just had a full day of normal things. And then I'd go back and read some scientific papers. So it was like I would take a few steps forward, then a few steps back, and then forward, then back. And then eventually over time, almost like a stock price chart, if you look at a stock or the stock market over long decades, the trend is upward, but there's ups and downs along the way. That's been my experience.
Yes. So this whole journey, how did it change you?
It's changed me in so many ways. And in some ways, the essence of who I've always been I realize it's always been there. It's a bizarre paradox that I can't really describe well. So the essence was always there, but maybe my appreciation of that essence is now shifted, so my life has changed. The first big change, after writing the first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, in 2018 published, and then my podcast series in 2019, Where's My Mind, I was at a crossroads because I had become a partner at my firm. I was well established. I was at a great firm where I had security in my career for a very long time. I was in my early 30s at that time. And then on the other hand, I was drawn to these big questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What is this place? What's really going on? How are we not told about this in school? And it was too difficult for me at that time to split my energies, to go into work and actually have to suppress this other part of me. So I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to me, which was I need to leave my firm and give myself some space.
And how did your family and friends react when you did that?
I know some people thought I was somewhat crazy, but at the same time, I had written a book and done a podcast, so they knew I was very passionate about it. But for many people, they couldn't understand it because I had spent a whole lifetime building a career and getting to a great place. Why would I leave that? That didn't make any sense. But for me, there was a bigger purpose ultimately that I don't think I even fully know now, but I just knew it was not where I was before. So I left that firm and now have been writing more books for the last several years, and I don't know where it's going to lead me. But that's that kind of attitude of basically trusting the energy and the flow. That's a complete shift.
You told me you had a little cushion that helped you to make that step. A lot of people sometimes feel like, okay, I need to make this switch. I need to leave this career because it's making me unhappy. I feel my soul wants me to do something else, but they don't have the courage to do it. Courage is derived from the French word keer, but also from Latin cor, which means heart. So you need heart, you need courage in order to say, okay, I'm going to follow my life and my soul. What would you recommend people who are on that crossroad, who want to make that step but are afraid because they are afraid of losing their financial security and so on? What is your advice to them?
Well, I would say that each situation is different. Even for me, I started researching in 2016. I didn't leave my job until end of 2019, early 2020. So it took even me time, and I was fully on this path. So it benefited me to be in my job for that period. There was a lot that I learned, and so there were good things for that. It was good for me to split my energy up to a point. What I find in myself and others is that there's a tipping point where it becomes too difficult to manage, and we have an option. We can stay in the pain and suffer every day, or make a change. And part of making the change involves having faith. So that's a big part of it. How much conviction do you actually have? And it was a test for me, really. Mark, do you really believe the things that you're writing about? Are you going to make this shift, or are you going to stay in the old world? And I had to make a leap, and sometimes there's a bit of blindness to it. I couldn't see what was ahead.
Absolutely.
So that's a decision each person has to make on their own.
There's two things that I can say about that. I think that from all the people that I've interviewed who became really successful just by following their aliveness, their soul, it all happened through a crisis. They just wanted to fit in, they just wanted to be normal, but all of a sudden there's so much pain in their life that they have no choice but to make that switch, because the conventional rational wisdom is not able to help them anymore. The second thing is, Martin Luther King said this, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. Start to follow that energy and trust that it will take you to the next thing you need to know, the next information that will help you on your way. So it's very important every time when we need to make a decision that, you know, we can look at all the pros and the cons and look at it from a rational, logical perspective, but also how does it feel when I go left? What is the aliveness telling me? What is the aliveness telling me when I go right? So energy is an intelligence, and it's not lying to us.
That's a great analogy. Another one that I've used in my book, second book, An End Upside Down Living, is imagine that you have a helicopter view of looking at a person walking through a maze.
Yes.
From the helicopter's perspective, you can see the end point of that
Yes.
maze. But when you're walking through it as a person, you just see what's immediately in front.
Yes, yes.
And you have to just trust, like you say, based on the energy and the feeling of
Yes.
it. That's what leads you in different paths.
Absolutely. If you look at the perspective of the mind and the heart, when you're on a boat on a river, the mind can only see the next bend, the next turn on the river. But if you are the heart, you can see, or the soul, and the heart is really the seat of the soul. The soul can see the whole river from source to sea. The only problem is we are not told how to rely on the soul. And we can only start to trust the soul when we start to experiment with it, I think, right? Because when we are born, we don't get the manual of how we should live. And I have learned that the mind cannot help us to figure out who we really are and why we're really here. We can only figure that out once we open our hearts and connect with our soul. Our soul has the answers. But we have to experiment with it. We have to experiment with the energy and the aliveness.
It's trial and error
Yeah.
of discerning what the different intuitions are.
Yes.
And sometimes it's actually not an intuition that's coming from higher intelligence.
Yes.
It's our own personality getting in the way.
Yes.
So by trying, like you
Yes.
say, we try and then we see where it didn't work and where
Yes.
it does work.
Yes.
And then we can start to discern
Yes.
this intangible thing better. And it's hard to even talk about because I can't point to it on a screen. It's in
Yes.
our own consciousness.
Yes.
And it's very abstract.
It's between you and you. But once the personality or the mind starts to see that the soul is working from a higher perspective, a higher intelligence, then it starts to give permission to the soul to be the master. And then the personality starts to serve the energy of the soul more and more and more. But when the personality or the mind does not believe in the higher self or the soul, then it will not be able to serve that energy of the soul.
Right. And it starts with that awareness and the desire,
Yes.
the intention to do it.
Yes.
So that's something that anyone can do. Even, let's say, you're in a job you don't like. You can set that intention to say, I'm going to align with my higher purpose, with the soul, however you want to say it,
Yes.
and open my mind to what the broader reality is. I want the truth.
Yes.
Setting that intention.
Yes.
So it's like orienting a compass
Yes.
in a different direction. And what I find is that the first thing that happens is the compass shifts in your own mind, and then reality and life start to shift later. It's like a delayed reaction.
Yes.
Sometimes it's fast, it can be fast,
Yes.
but in my experience, sometimes it's gradual.
Yes. So Mark, you're still young, you're 38, but you have a body of work of 7 books at this point. What is the most important message after your research and after written 7 books? What is your most important research here, message here based on your research to our audience here in the Netherlands and Belgium?
Well, my most recent book, it's called An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. It's about cosmology. And the dedication of that book is to those who are comfortable with 3 important words: I don't know. It's very important to acknowledge our limitations in what we actually know to be true. And if you think about it hard, what do you know with certainty?
What do you know for sure?
The only thing, at least that I've come up with so far, is that at this moment, it feels like I'm conscious. Everything else is an inference.
Yes.
Because everything is based on a perceptual organ or even the past. I think the past is true, but all I have is a memory or a picture that I'm looking at in the present moment.
Yes.
And you could apply this to everything you do. And I do think there's David Hawkins, one of my favorite spiritual teachers. He talked about radical humility. To me, this is radical humility. If we can get there, it's hard. To say, I actually don't know. Everything I think I know is just provisional. It's based on what I've been exposed to, but in the future, I might actually change my opinion. Having that mentality with everything in life, including our own beliefs about ourselves and our own lives, so our internal beliefs, but also the worldly beliefs, I think it's a big part of shifting that compass.
Oh, that's beautiful. So if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you on the internet?
My website is a good place to start. It's just my name, markgober.com, MarkGober.com. I have 7 books, like you said. They are on Amazon, and each book is in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible. But in Dutch, there are 2 books currently.
And I have them here. So the first one is in Dutch, Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van vrijheid. I don't know if you can pronounce that.
I can't.
So it's in Dutch. It's your publisher is succesboeken.nl.
Yes.
Succesboeken.nl. And then your other book is in Dutch, Een einde aan de omgekeerde wereld van geneeskunde. Ook gepubliceerd door succesboeken.nl. So I would highly recommend those 2 books for our Dutch-speaking viewers. Mark, one more question. If you are, if life would end for you today, what would be the most important thing for you? If you would become soul energy again, if you would leave your body, what is then the most important thing that you would want to leave people with?
Yeah, I think about that all the time. I think when we begin to think of consciousness beyond the body, it's a natural thing. What is the bodily life? Is it finite in the way we think? So I don't look at the bodily life as it is finite as a body, but I think there's way beyond. So I'm not afraid of death in that sense. So I'm always thinking to myself, have I fulfilled the things that my soul is here to do?
Yes.
So when I write a book, often what happens is I learn about a topic and I say, this is really edgy. I don't know if I can publish this.
Yes.
This might be dangerous. Maybe people are going to think I'm crazy. And then I have to sit with it and I realize I have to do this. Yes. Because there's some truth in here that might lead people to ask questions. I have to do it.
Yes.
And then there's a satisfaction I get afterwards of, okay, I did my duty. And then it's behind me. I sort of forget that I did it. I don't even identify with it.
Yes.
So that's how I think about my day-to-day is there something that's unfinished? Is there something that's incomplete? And I'm getting to a point more and more where I feel totally at peace. I'm not fully there, but I've done the things that I feel like I should be doing, and I'm not wasting my time.
So you're trying to fulfill the intentions of your soul.
Yeah.
Yes, that's beautiful. Gary Zukav calls that authentic power, when the personality starts to serve the energy of the soul, and our soul is not passive. Our soul has intentions. There's a reason why we are here temporarily in a physical body. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. It was an honor and a privilege to be able to compare notes with you. Ram Dass says we're all just walking each other home, and I think you and I are trying to do that. So thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.